you. So this talk is slightly more along the lines of Mikhail Stransky's talk yesterday, which this is a kind of critique of a whole discipline, actually, a kind of what kinds of procedures are done, specifically in social psychology. So experimental deception is a technique that's widely used in psychology, but not just in psychology. So if Mikhail's main fixation was poetry yesterday, my main fixation is theater. So this would be Shakespeare's Globe Theater, because I've had this very strong intuition that the conduct of these experiments are kind of theater. And anyone who does experiments who does not treat this seriously is not doing it well, I think. I've taught experimental psychology before, and the students who do not have the intuition that it is a kind of theater are not, usually do not do it well. So this is from Daniel Kahneman. So the main points I would like to try to make is that when I say we, I mean psychologists, meaning psychologists, empiricists who do these kinds of studies are not thinking about it enough in terms of a technique. There's lots of critique about the experimental deception in terms of its ethics. There's lots of ink spilled about the ethical dimension of it, but not enough as a technique. I think this has implications for actually the stability of the science, and maybe some of you are aware that some of the sciences, not just psychology, including medical sciences, biology, are going through this kind of replicability crisis. If you've heard of that, which has been spun around to a credibility revolution. So I think this is a missed kind of dimension of such a thing. Meaning, if there is a dimension of your technique that you're not aware of and have not conceptualized clearly, this could be a source of your problems. I am not an ethologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a linguist, but I'm trying to reach for where the account might be, because the psychologists have not come up with it, so it has to come from somewhere, and I think they might be at least useful places to look. Now, when I say deception in experiments, so just to give you a few examples, one would be classic Milgram experiment, shock generator, obedience, testing whether people will obey even an immoral kind of instruction. Okay, there have been more recent kind of accounts of whether or not the participants were actually believing what was happening here, and that's like within the past month, actually, a new paper came out critiquing the Milgram experiment. But I think, broadly, beyond Milgram, others have done the same experiment, and it replicates more or less well. So I think this is a kind of a classic example of deception, because if you were a participant there, you were supposed to believe that the electricity, the shocks being given to the learner are real, that they're being hurt, even though they are not. There's actually no real electricity. So that's the main deception happening there. You're supposed to believe that there is hurt happening to this person. And then in economics, although economists as a discipline have eschewed the use of deception, at least formally they say that we do not like deception, we should not do it. But there are some kind of field experiments, and one very nice one published, I think this year, is showing that if around the world, in various cities around the world, if you surrender a wallet to certain people, maybe authorities or whatever, and say, oh, someone lost this, could you please, I'm just a tourist, I'm leaving now, I can't take care of this, could you make sure this gets to this owner? And it contains identification, etc., etc. And then sometimes it contains no money, sometimes it contains some money, sometimes it contains a lot of money. And the interesting thing, the counterintuitive finding they have is like, the more money it has, the more it will be returned. Okay? Meaning there is some kind of pro-social impulse. People are not just rationally saying, oh, there's money, I would not return. So that's it. But for this talk, the idea is, the deception there is to make you believe that this is actually a real wallet lost by a real individual, and it should be returned to a real individual, even though the address given there is just their lab or an office or kind of shell office, I guess. So like in different kinds of behavioral experiments, deception is used, and that's the idea when we say experimental deception. People should believe something that the experimenter wants them to believe, because it has some causal link to the behavior that you want to observe. So now I have lots of concerns about the way experiments are done, and deception is just one of them. But I think it's like, if you're a fan of Calvin and Hobbes, just like I am, you would know the idea of Calvin ball, where it's a game where you just make up the rules as you play it, and the only rule is you should not make up a rule that has been made up before. So it always has to be a new rule. So that's Calvin ball. And my worry is like, you know, there is no codification of deception. I've tried to look in the textbooks of experimental psychology. They do not discuss the technique. They discuss it as an ethical question, but it's not discussed about how do you do it well. What is a good deception? What are the elements of a good deception, etc. So that means each lab seems to be free to create its own definition of Calvin ball, more or less, in terms of deception. And I think that's bad. All of these labs around the world, they have their own laboratory lore that they follow, and no one else knows what they're doing. So that's bad. Now this is like one of the things that Exhibit 1 that alerted me to that there might be a problem here. Like about 10 years ago, I read this study. So there's this kind of study first described by Bala and Profit, where they make participants stand in front of a hill, and in one condition of it, they're wearing a heavy backpack, and then they're asked to estimate how steep the hill is, give an estimate of how steep it is. And the other condition, they're not wearing anything, or either they're wearing a backpack that doesn't contain much of anything at all, an empty backpack. So the idea is, it's a kind of embodied cognition hypothesis where you're interpreting the amount of effort you're carrying, and you're transferring that in an irrational manner to your estimate of the hill. So it's kind of maybe you can say anchoring, maybe you can say some kind of misattribution of effort to the perceptual task. So but however the theory might work, the idea is that's the effect, and they claim to have replicated it in various studies. Now the interesting thing is, in 2009, Durgin showed that they were trying to replicate it. They thought it was true, so they were trying to replicate it. They failed, and then they noticed that lots of the participants actually saw through the manipulation. They actually were able to guess that, oh, it's because of this backpack, right? I was supposed to make some kind of judgment because I'm wearing this backpack. And so when they made a version of the experiment where there was a good reason why you're wearing the backpack, so that you can't guess that it's only because to screw around with your intuitions, then the effect disappears. Meaning if you give them a good kind of cover story, and they believe the cover story, they now have nothing else to attribute it to, and it disappears. So meaning it seems they were just being good participants because they saw through the hypothesis, and when you take care of that, no effect. So that's bad. So it's like, this could be an isolated case, but I don't think so. I don't think so because we've tried to look for it. So in 2015, there was a study published in Science by a collective around the world, several 100 labs around the world, tried to replicate 100 experiments in social and cognitive psychology, 100. And then what they found is like, surprisingly, around 30% of them were replicable. So there are lots of debates around what does that mean. But what the good thing is, all of their protocols are in the online repository. They're open data. So we took all of the protocols, 100 protocols, and then we coded for which ones had deception, which studies involved deception, which did not. We coded them, and then we looked at how they related to the success of the replication. What we find is across the 100 or the 99 that we were able to unambiguously classify as either with deception or not, you see that if there's in the group of studies with no deception, it's like kind of 50-50, but in terms of success is the white or gray kind of bar. But if when the group deception studies, it's like it's markedly smaller the replication success. And then when you look at effect sizes, meaning how strong the effect is, it's negative. There's a negative correlation between effect size and effect deception. Now this is a not-out argument because it's just 100 studies. You don't know whether it covers the wide variety of studies being done. And then people have said, well, if you divide it between the cognitive and social psychology studies, cognitive studies tend to do much better, and even though they have deception. But still, I think at least, even though this is not a test of the hypothesis that there's something wrong, my idea is it should motivate us to think that there could be a problem and therefore to think hard about it. So these are like exhibits to motivate an argument rather than evidence for an argument. Okay, and then if you think about it generally in terms of warrants, in terms of what is it you're testing, how are you warranted to argue that your conclusions prove your theory? So from Paul Meehl, it's like the idea is even though you think you're testing a theory and your observations confirm the theory or falsify whatever the theory, actually, what you're testing is theory together with some auxiliary theories, together with the conditions, and those are all mostly implicit. And the thing is, auxiliaries can be spelled out, meaning in psychology we have very sophisticated models for measurement, psychometrics, IQ testing, personality testing. We have like formal models for those. But there is no formal model or even informal model for this experimental deception, meaning it's not spelled out at all. It's just assumed that, actually it's a kind of post hoc thing. If we can show you that it worked on a small sample, we assume that it works. So it's always a post hoc thing, meaning we show that it works, therefore it works. And then we can use it in the larger study. But there's no way for you to a priori critique a deception procedure, whether it's good or not. It's always only in the eating. Okay? You can never actually say prior to the deception whether it will work or not, because there is no account like that. It doesn't exist. There is no vocabulary. We need one, I think, in order to actually describe what we're doing so that we can critique it. Without this vocabulary, we cannot even talk about it. Okay? But it doesn't exist in psychology, so maybe I should look elsewhere. So if we look at ethology, the idea of signaling, there's the idea that you might be believed more if you can show that what you're signaling is costly. So that's what happens in camouflage, in predator-prey kind of interactions. If I can show, or actually mating signaling, if I can show that this thing I have, like the peacock's tail, is costly for me, that means it shows I'm actually more fit individual. So that's the idea of signaling. Now how that transfers over to experimental technique is not clear. What does it mean to be costly? So I'd like to draw on like more sociological kind of accounts of signaling. So like from Irving Goffman, idea that maybe it's the way in which I think someone has mentioned indices before in terms of signaling, and the idea is, although we can't properly talk of in human behavior like clear indices of anything. At least it seems that we tend to treat certain kinds of behaviors as having some kind of indexical kind of quality. Say, for example, if someone seems embarrassed, we seem to take that as a kind of thing that people are, we assume that that's costly because we assume that no one wants to be embarrassed. So you might have some kind of theory that says that if it looks like that some event or behavior was costly to the experimenter in terms of embarrassment, in terms of loss of authority, in terms of loss of credibility, maybe that will be believed more if that actually was a deception. Meaning if you can make it so that when you're trying to deceive them, at the same time you look embarrassed or you look foolish as an experimenter, maybe that actually can count as a costly signal. Because I wouldn't do this if this would actually lower me in terms of authority. So maybe that actually can be some kind of start of a theory of kind of calculated unintentionality, a signaling kind of account. So that's just an example. But I think there's something you can look at signaling as a possible way to start with an account. And then I also like to appeal to the pragmatics of the situation, in that, well, we can actually ask, what do the norms of trust, do the norms of common ground, do the norms of shared assumptions work in the same way in an experiment? After all, it's clear to most people, unless it's a kind of, unless they don't even know they're in an experiment, it's clear to most people entering a lab that it's an artificial environment, even though it's made, you can make it look as natural as you want. As long as you know it's an experiment, then, maybe certain assumptions about common ground are, suspended. So then, but what does that mean about communication within the experiment? What does that mean about the pragmatics of it? What does it mean about, am I being, communicating in good faith, etc., etc.? So maybe actually, maybe it diverges. If you're suspicious, maybe you don't share common ground. But maybe if you're not suspicious, maybe you actually communicate in the same way that you would communicate outside the experiment, and therefore we have to make different assumptions depending on whether you are a suspicious participant or not. And then stage magic. I see very clearly that there's something to learn here, because if you think about it, you go into a stage magician show, you expect to be deceived, and yet you are still anyway. You're still deceived anyway. So this is something, I think psychology can learn something here, and there is a psychology of stage magic after all. But it just hasn't fed into the methodology. But the thing is, like good cover stories, in the example of the Durgan backpack experiment, it's like good cover stories give you, well, it should give you cover. That's what it's supposed to do. And the thing is, in magic tricks, that's what it does. It kind of misleads you. Misdirection is always the word used in magic. So the idea is you supply people with a kind of coherent enough explanation. They don't have to believe it, but it will kind of skew or bias their ideas already, and that can help you in the deception. Okay? So I think, yeah, so it's like, all of this taken together, still there is this problem about, what you want is for the person to believe a certain thing. But there is really no kind of procedure that will, or at least there's no account in which you can actually assure that. It's easy to conceal information, but in order for the person to actually have a certain kind of belief, then you will, like I said in one of the questions earlier, you have to rule out all other beliefs, so that only this belief is left in that subject's head. But then how do you exactly do that? That seems to imply enormous amounts of control, information control, in an experiment. And I don't think most experiments achieve that kind of control. And yet most psychologists assume that that's the control that they have. So it's like, in conclusion, there seems to be no clear reason for psychologists to stop using deception, because there are just some topics you cannot study without it. Okay? Say obedience. You can't say, I'm studying obedience. Would you join my experiment? Okay, so you can't say that and still expect them to behave in a way that you would expect. So if we're going to do it, then we have to take it seriously. And in a way, this is kind of invitation for philosophers of science, sociologists of science, ethnographers, meaning I would like to see like an ethnography of the experimental lab. They've done it for chemistry, they've done it for physics. I'd like to see someone embed themselves in a psychology lab and make fine descriptions of what's happening, because there simply does not exist. We should model it as explicitly as we measure other measurements in psychology. What that would look like, I don't know, but I would like to see that. So the slides you can get from here, and there's a preprint of this paper over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your talk. So are there any questions? Well, then I will have some comment, or do you?
So this is really interesting. I think I'm delighted that you're doing what you're doing. I guess, given what you said at the very end, how can we help? Right? What could be done? I mean, I don't know that they're looking for help, but you know,
They just don't know it yet.
I mean, for example, what was fascinating with the case of being unable, that the change in the cover story, for example, for the people who were judging the what's it,
The steepness,
steepness of that hill, right? So I mean, cover stories we could come up with.
Or what we need is like an account of how these work, why they work, which kinds work versus which kinds. Like more than just like a collection of post hoc observations. Like some kind of, you know, sufficient and necessary conditions about what a deception should be.
Right. I guess I think that we could maybe, I mean, I don't know that there's lack of definitions out there for them to make use of. I mean, it seems like involving people who work on deception in crafting your cover story and in designing your test would be good for everybody, because then the experiments would be helpful to the non-experimental, I mean, to philosophers and to the people conducting the experiments in psychology or whatever. So I guess what literally should be done to make that possible? I don't know if this is an intellectual property matter for a lab that they're not going to share. I don't know if they don't care about what the philosophers think. They only care about the other psychologists, and the other psychologists aren't contesting the meaning of deception. So, I mean, is there an interest in having us do quality control on experiments?
There's lots of discussion now, but not particularly in this topic, but generally on methods about involving non-psychologists in the discussion because of that, like I mentioned, because of this trouble with replication and the lack of reliability for some, not all, some findings. So I think there's more openness now than there was 10 years ago. They would, I think, but not everybody in psychology. So the people who are more aligned with the reform movement in psychology, the open science movement, they are the ones talking to philosophers right now, philosophers of science mainly, philosophers of statistics. But not enough is being done about the procedure. So it's more about so far about warrant, statistics and inference, but no one, or some people are beginning to invest also in procedure. And I think, yeah, there would be people there, and I would like to encourage more of that.
Hey, thanks so much. I really thought that was super. I learned a lot. I guess I think, and it's going to sound like I'm making a bad joke, but I'm really not. I guess I think these questions are all the more important because it seems like, here's the bad joke part, anyone who volunteers for an experiment, say with a social psych lab, has to go in knowing that I shouldn't believe anything they tell me, right? I mean,
That's an empirical question, whether or not what they think before they go in. And actually, that's something to be determined. Meaning, it could be that as the semester goes on, you become more and more distrustful.
Has no one done that sort of work?
Some people have done, and some people have claimed that there is a lot more suspicion and it's bad. It harms the results. Yeah. There is one paper by economists, on the other hand, that seems to say, no, it's not harming. I have a feeling that it depends on the effect you're studying. Some effects are just not, not vulnerable to whatever belief you have. But I think some phenomenon are just too belief-based for beliefs about credibility not to play a role. So there are some people. So it's an argument. Yeah, it is an argument.
So I mean, and I guess some of the, and I'm trying to remember now, and I may be getting that wrong, but some remembering the original Milgram experiments as those were carried out in different iterations.
Yes.
It was way more successful when it was done at Yale with crisp, pressed white coats, and way less effective, if I'm remembering correctly, when it was done in an industrial area and there were cigarette burns in the experimenter's lab coat. I'm wondering if that's a way, I mean, that somehow...
I don't remember the details,
oh, okay.
but yes, I think the paper I was alluding to that's beginning to question it is making the point that across the different versions of it, and there were several versions of it just by Milgram, and then there were versions outside of Milgram's lab. And yes, there was much variation in terms of how many people claim to not believe that the person was actually suffering.
Yeah, I mean.
So there was lots of fluctuation. So what things predicted, it could be any of those. So I think that's Gina Perry. I think is the one doing work on this. So they're looking at the archives, looking at the questionnaires that Milgram gave out after the experiment to the participants. So and they're trying to piece together what actually happened, because Milgram was a bit, kind of badgery about the way he defended his. So I think it's a real effect. It's just that maybe he oversold it.
Hey, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions? So I will have just brief comment. I do think that this is closely connected to ecological validity of the given
Definitely, yes.
given testing or given experiment. And also I'm a little bit, well, we've got a problem to define how successful, for example, argument can be. And you cannot a priori define the successfulness of some argument. If I give an argument to an audience, I'm unsure how persuasive it will be. So I'm a little bit skeptical that you can do this with a deception from a priori point of view. A little bit like it seems to me that it's too much to be able to say, well, yeah, this will work. I think that this is only like intuition about the deception, about the given deception, much more likely than that you will be able somehow to measure it.
Oh, okay. Well,
But I'm unsure about it. I'm just saying, because I know that in the argumentation theory it's basically, it's not so easy to do, and you are unable to basically say that this argument will be persuasive and this will not to give an audience. You can only just guess it.
Is it even at all possible just to say what would a bad argument look like at the very least?
That's even harder.
That's even harder.
Yeah,
Okay.
because well, what does it mean that it's a bad argument? Well, yeah, but just guessing that the measurement might be a little difficult and it will depend on many things, the settings of the experiment and the ecological validity, and of course the replicability, and if the even the validity itself, not only ecological validity.
Okay, so you're saying it will be very hard. So I
At least.
I buy that. I get that.
Okay. Okay. So thank you again.
Thank you.